I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Statistics Canada says that Canada's inflation rate tumbled to 2.8% in June, putting it within the Bank of Canada's target range. The federal agency says that the deceleration was broad-based. The lower gasoline prices compared with last year led the slowdown. But Canadians aren't seeing any relief at grocery stores yet. This comes as prices rose 9.1% year over year, which is slightly faster than in May. The Bank of Canada's rate hikes are also feeding into higher inflation through mortgage interest costs. The federal agency says that excluding mortgage interest costs, inflation would have risen to 2% year over year. The central bank raised interest rates earlier this month, in part because of concerns that inflation would stay high for longer. Well, joining us now to discuss this further is Dr. Moshe Lander, economist and professor at Concordia University. Dr. Lander, always great having you.
Hello.
So let's start with this. Why are we seeing such a big disparity between overall inflation and food inflation, Dr. Lander?
Yeah, so inflation, remember, is an increase in the average price of a basket of goods and services that the typical consumer buys. So when we say that it's the average, that means that there's a lot of things in that basket that might be rising more, some are rising less, some might be outright falling. And so unfortunately for Canadians, the big headline items that are rising quickly are the things that we see the most, groceries and rent or mortgage. And the things that are falling the most are also things that we see a lot, which is gasoline prices. So where normally these things might be in the middle of the distribution, it just seems that they're at the outer tips in this case. And so it's really making eyebrows raise.
Definitely. Now, Dr. Lander, meanwhile, it seems that mortgage interest costs are actually feeding into inflation. So can you walk us through this, considering that rising interest rates are meant to slow inflation?
Yeah, so again, it's just part of the basket, right? All of us need rent or mortgage as part of our housing cost. And so when interest rates go from record lows to 20-year highs, anybody who has to reset their mortgage, you could have been getting a fixed rate mortgage as low as 1.7% a few years ago. Now that's probably over 5, maybe even at 6%. So of course, it's going to show up in the figures. The good news is that as interest rates remain at this level for an extended period, we'd be talking in 12 months about how inflation is leveled off because the cost of housing hasn't risen as much.
So do you think the Bank of Canada should maybe rethink its interest rate strategy, considering the impact of mortgage interest rates on overall inflation right now?
No. So the Bank of Canada needs to keep inflation at 2. And you did say in the intro there that they're now in their target range, but they're in their target range right now. And that doesn't mean they're going to be there next month or in 6 months. And so once they're convinced that interest rate or inflation is steadily in that 2% range, the way it used to be a couple of years ago, then the Bank of Canada might look at actually decreasing interest rates. The long-term rate is probably somewhere around 4.5% to 5%. So there's room for them to cut interest rates, but they need to know that inflation is firmly anchored in that 1% to 3%. 1 month's data doesn't mean that's true.
And taking a look at current trends, how likely are we to see another interest rate hike in the near future or a pause? What are your thoughts on that?
So the next meeting is in September. So the only thing that's going to happen between now and then is we'll get another jobs report and we'll see another picture of GDP. If the economy continues to grow faster than expected and if more jobs than expected are being created, then they might decide to bump up interest rates. But I don't really think that that's going to happen in September. I think they might want to wait for another set of inflation data and see what's happening before they decide what to do with interest rates. That next meeting then would be in October. And so I think we've got a couple of months here where we can ride out where we currently are.
And on the topic of inflation readings, it seems that inflation was lowered primarily because of one-off price reductions in gasoline prices and a reduction in price for telecommunication services like the internet and cell phone services. So does this mean that inflation is likely to creep back up if these factors increase in price?
It's possible, but we can start playing those games, Nima, with almost anything that's within the basket, right? So if you take out gasoline, for example, inflation was 4%. But if you take out food and you take out mortgage costs, inflation was only 2%. So that's the thing with averages. It's the same way that if we drop the best student in the class, the average comes down. If we drop the worst student, the average goes up. We still include them in the average because they're part of the class. This is part of the basket. And so what it's suggesting is that the overall basket isn't rising as quickly. But again, there's great disparity within the numbers.
All right, a quick 30 seconds left here, Dr. Lander. But in terms of these sky-high grocery prices, can Canadians expect any relief in the near future?
Probably not. The thing is that all we could expect is that prices will not rise as fast. but it's unlikely that prices are going to fall. The broader issue here, something we can talk about another time, is a lack of competition within the entire food supply chain, going all the way back to the farm itself. And so when you lack competition, that gives everybody along that chain the ability to increase prices, and we pay more than we otherwise have to because of that lack of competition.
Lots to consider. Dr. Lander, thank you again for your time today.
Anytime.
And now we turn to the world of video games, where Microsoft is now one step closer to finalizing their acquisition of Activision Blizzard. The proposed purchase of the famous video game company put Microsoft under the microscope with U.S. regulators at the Federal Trade Commission. Regulators sought to axe the deal because they said it would hurt competition, but their argument was not enough to convince a federal judge. The judge in question stated that the FTC had not shown a likelihood that it will prevail, and the FTC's request to appeal the decision was promptly declined. This clears the path for the $68.7 billion deal, which would be the biggest acquisition in tech history. Well, joining us now to discuss the case and how this would impact video game enthusiasts is Mr. Stephen Kent, Media Director at the Consumer Choice Center. Mr. Kent, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So just for some brief background for our viewers, can you walk us through Microsoft's interest in acquiring Activision Blizzard and why the FTC brought this case forward in the first place?
Yes, so Microsoft's interest in Activision Blizzard is really about the same as Netflix's interest in having shows like Friends and The Office on their platform, or Disney reacquiring some of its IP from other streamers. You want to have popular titles and beloved content so that people offer up their money for your subscription services. So their move to acquire Activision Blizzard is to bring Call of Duty and games like Candy Crush underneath their umbrella, as well as the really talented and top-notch game developers who make those things, so that Microsoft can be more competitive in this new coming age of cloud gaming, mobile gaming, and virtual reality. Now, the FTC brought this case supposedly to protect a competitive environment for consoles in the United States. That's Nintendo, that's the PlayStation, that's the Xbox. But like you said, when they went to federal court and argued their case for 5 days in front of Judge Jackie Corley, they were pretty much shown the door and shown that they did not actually bring forward a consumer interest case, but just sort of an open-ended complaint about corporate mergers altogether, and they lost.
And I guess the big question here would be, would the console gaming market still be competitive after this merger?
Well, Judge Corley certainly thought so. And that's why she denied that request for an injunction. And that's also why the court shot down their request for an appeal. Look, right now, PlayStation has a 70% market share. That's Sony's PlayStation, 70% market share internationally. And video gaming is a global market. Microsoft and their Xbox platform in this situation is actually sort of a market underdog. So them bringing in the most popular game in the world underneath their umbrella, that's really, really good for them. And PlayStation is rightly not super happy about that. But lucky for them, there has long been verbal agreements and also signed agreements on paper for them to continue being able to license Call of Duty. It's in nobody's interest for Call of Duty to become platform specific to the Xbox.
And on that note, what is the current state of competition in the overall video game industry?
I mean, it's very competitive. All these different games and their platforms have very loyal consumers who enjoy their game platforms for different reasons. I personally am an Xbox guy. I don't like using PlayStation. I don't really know why, but PlayStation gamers, they also have very strong feelings about the Xbox. It's just sort of about the experience. And so leave it to gamers to have very strong opinions about what they use. And Call of Duty is a game that's going to appear on all these platforms, regardless of who owns it.
All right, just about a minute and a half here. But in terms of the broader impact of this ruling, how do you see this impacting similar cases in the EU, where Microsoft is trying to appeal against the UK's block of this deal?
I mean, you can expect the regulatory bodies elsewhere in the world to now start to really follow suit. I believe the only holdout at this point is the UK. The EU has also gotten on board. Turkey, Canada is moving along as well in this direction. So this deal is going to go through. Biden's FTC here in the United States under Lena Khan, this is a huge defeat for them. This is their fourth defeat in court trying to stop corporate mergers. And it's really just a big reminder to everybody watching here that if you're going to argue against corporate mergers as having an adverse effect on the consumer experience, you better be able to actually argue that. But a lot of Biden's progressive kind of allies in the agencies right now really just don't want to see companies grow at all. And so this was sort of a effort to extract costs from Microsoft for expanding the size of their company, even though they couldn't prove in court that it was bad for consumers.
Very interesting. Mr. Kent, thank you again for your time today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right, up next, we have our conversation with journalist Maria Cheng about the forced sterilization of Inuit women here in Canada. The subject matter we'll be discussing is deeply troubling. It includes details that may be disturbing for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. A new report by the Associated Press highlights what seems to be the continuation of forced sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada. This comes decades after many other rich countries stopped forcefully sterilizing Indigenous women. Numerous activists, doctors, politicians, and at least 5 class action lawsuits allege that the practice has not yet ended in Canada. The Canadian Senate issued a report last year confirming that Indigenous women continue to be sterilized without their knowledge or consent. Documents obtained by the Associated Press shows that a doctor was punished just 2 months ago for forcibly sterilizing an Inuit woman in 2019. We're now joined by the journalist who broke this story, Maria Cheng from the Associated Press. Ms. Cheng, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Some very troubling information in this report, Ms. Cheng. Before we dive right into this, can you clarify to our viewers what exactly the practice of forced sterilization of Indigenous people is and what it looks like in Canada?
Sure. Well, it's a practice that dates back to when eugenics was still in place in Canada and a lot of other countries, when women who were considered inferior were essentially sterilized. But it's a practice that continues to this day under slightly different circumstances, when women, typically after birth, are coerced into this, or they're having some sort of procedure and the doctor or nurse does this without their knowledge, without their consent. So it is shocking that we're talking about this in 2023.
Absolutely shocking indeed, ma'am. So in terms of the research, can you walk us through the documents obtained by the Associated Press around the forced sterilization of Indigenous women? Just how many recent cases have you come across?
It's very hard to tell. I mean, we did speak with the Senator Yvonne Boyer, who is collecting that data, and they've collected about 12,000 cases, but that is only from one province. So if you think that this is a practice that occurred across Canada, the real number is far higher. The Associated Press had documents about this 2019 case in particular, which was pretty egregious considering that it was other health professionals in the operating room who tried to stop it. So the fact that this happened in 2019 over the objections of other health staff was very concerning.
And considering this horrible practice has ended in other rich countries like the US, how is this disturbing practice continuing in Canada? What is missing in terms of protections for Indigenous women in our country?
It's a very good question. And I think, we should talk to more indigenous leaders to see what protections they feel would be necessary to be put in place. I mean, some of the people I spoke to mentioned that there are cultural issues, translation difficulties, the fact that many Indigenous women have to leave their homes to fly hundreds of miles away to give birth, often without family support, without adequate translation, and obviously without enough consent information.
Definitely. And in terms of repercussions, especially when it comes to this 2019 case, the sterilization of an Inuit woman, what was the punishment for the doctor in this case? Have they lost their medical license?
His medical license was suspended for a few months. He was required to take an ethics course, and he was also required to compensate the medical authorities for the cost of the investigation. It is a crime under the criminal code, but at the moment, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has not said whether or not they will investigate this as a criminal matter.
And would you be able to tell us a little bit more about your research into this 2019 case? You mentioned that there were other medical professionals asking this doctor to not move forward with the sterilization. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
The sterilization occurred during a procedure which was meant to address another issue that this woman was having. He had obtained consent to possibly remove one fallopian tube, but to remove the other would leave her sterile, and she had not given permission for that. And the other health professionals were aware of that, and so were very disturbed when the surgeon moved to remove both of those fallopian tubes during the surgery, knowing that she had not consented.
And what have you been hearing from maybe the advocates that you've been speaking to regarding this case and regarding just the issue of forceful sterilization? What needs to be done in Canada, according to them?
Well, when you talk to the Indigenous activists, for one thing, this is not a rare occurrence. This is something that they're very familiar with, and they hear lots of stories about this. It's a practice that clearly has not ended. I think they would like recognition from the Canadian government that this has happened. I mean, Canada has denounced forced sterilization elsewhere in China among the Uyghur women quite forcefully, and yet it continues within its own borders. I think they would like that acknowledgement. I think they would like greater accountability for those who are doing this to make sure that they set a precedent that this is not acceptable and it should not be happening in Canada.
Clearly something that needs to be addressed. Ms. Chang, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
We'll be right back after the break. The debate around aspartame and its possible health impacts has been reignited after the World Health Organization deemed it as possibly carcinogenic. But the Canadian Cancer Society says that any evidence that aspartame causes cancer is limited and more research is needed. The expert panels that assessed aspartame found that it's still safe to consume as long as it's below recommended daily limits. Now, that limit is 40 milligrams of aspartame per kilogram of body weight. That means that an adult weighing 70 kilograms would have to drink between 9 and 14 cans of Diet Pop in a day to exceed the aspartame limit. Health Canada says that it will review the scientific data in the WHO reports and determine whether any action on aspartame is needed in Canada. Well, joining us now to unpack what we know so far about the artificial sweetener and others in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back.
Great to be here.
So what is it about aspartame in particular that makes it so interesting for researchers compared to other artificial sweeteners, Dr. Raut?
Well, I think it's one big reason. It's really widespread. It's the most widespread use as a sugar substitute, and it's the most commonly used one for any low-calorie or diet product. So researchers are particularly interested in understanding its safety profile because it has so many products that it affects. And if there's any potential link to health conditions or a metabolism issue, it's definitely worthwhile to explore. So far, what we've seen is it's been seen as safe within recommended limits by the expert panels.
And in terms of this WHO classification, it designated aspartame as possibly carcinogenic. So what does that mean, Dr. Raut? And how does the WHO determine the carcinogenic levels of certain products?
That's right. And you'll see those exclamation points everywhere, the possibly carcinogenic. And it really means that there's limited evidence suggesting a potential association between the substance and cancer. Now, the classification is really based on evaluating the available studies and looking at the data, and it's really performed by expert panels. So in the case of aspartame, the classification really comes from the studies that have shown some inconclusive evidence of a possible link to cancer, but that certainly means that there is need for further investigation. But it's important to note that does not mean that aspartame definitely causes cancer. It just means that we need more research and vigilance.
So what does this most recent designation mean for Diet Pop lovers watching this right now, Dr. Raut? Are they safe as long as they consume the recommended limit, or should they maybe reduce consumption in any way?
Right. So that's just keeping in mind that that classification is really based on some limited evidence, and it doesn't establish a direct link between aspartame and cancer. So as long as individuals are consuming aspartame in the recommended limits, which we were talking about earlier, it is considered safe by expert panels. Keep in mind that when we're looking at this classification, aspartame now is in the same classification of possibly carcinogenic as aloe vera extract or many pickled vegetables. So keeping that in mind, it doesn't mean it definitely causes cancer. It just means you want to keep limits and moderation when you're consuming.
And how does aspartame compare to other common artificial sweeteners like sucralose, for example, in terms of health risks, Dr. Raut?
Right. So sucralose and picolet, if you compare it with aspartame, very different chemical compositions, very different metabolic pathways in the body. Recent scientific evidence also looking at sucralose with some concern about safety as well. We know that sucralose can certainly cause issues with our gut biomes. And there was recently one study that came out that there was concern also about DNA damage. So, overall, what we're saying is we're seeing that all of these artificial sweeteners are having some data associated with it for either damage or gut microbiome use or even cancer now. So certainly moderation is key, regardless of which sweetener.
All right, Dr. Rao. Now, meanwhile, there are plenty of health concerns around regular sugar consumption. So how does regular sugar compare to artificial sweeteners in terms of health concerns?
Right. So with regular sugar, we know the data very well. They have their own set of health regulations. We're looking at weight gain, dental issues, increased risk of chronic conditions like type 2 diabetes. And of course, artificial sweeteners have their own concerns as well. They're non-nutritive and don't raise blood sugar levels, but there are these other concerns here as well. So really, it's a matter of picking one evil versus the other. I think the key here is having a very balanced approach to it.
And just about 30 seconds left here, Dr. Rao. But as a doctor yourself, how many times have you come across cases in which there are health-related concerns around the consumption of aspartame?
Right. So I see what I see with my patients is some potential side effects, gastrointestinal discomfort or headaches, but these are relatively rare and in general considered safe.
All right, Dr. Rao, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website and follow us on our social media accounts. We're available on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again for joining us today on Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you next time, Canada. Have a great weekend.